This is George Lucas, and welcome to the audio commentary. This really is conceived as a 6-part movie, of which episode 1 is the first chapter, and sometimes it's difficult to keep that in mind, that each film, while it's important in itself and relates to what's going on in that film and has to be entertaining in itself, really is fitting into a larger mosaic, and that the whole enterprise won't really be understood, I think, until you can actually sit down and watch all 6 episodes and then follow the story, because we're dealing in micro stories here. The larger picture is kind of a different story. Structurally, all the movies start exactly the same way, go from titles, pan down to a ship or to a planet or to something. But we have a fairly stringent stylistic design to these things, so they all work exactly the same. The films are designed to be primarily like silent films, and the dialogue and the effects and everything are just part of the musical composition to tell the story visually rather than through a lot of heavy dialogue. The films are actually composed along the lines of music, which is that there are many themes going on through the films, and the themes are repeated using different orchestration. I'll tell a story in one way and then I'll change it and have the same story or the same dialogue used by other characters in other situations, so that you have this sort of recurring theme going on constantly.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this is a thematic note that continues through all the movies. It's a kind of jokey one, but there's a lot more that are more on the serious side. But it really is designed as a piece of music where you have a melodic, thematic device that is used over and over again. These kind of scenes on this particular film on the bridge were kind of interesting. It's the first time we actually shot with no set, and it was very interesting to try to figure out how we were going to put all this together, because all I really had was the 2 Neimoidians there and a door, and everything else was done in blue screen or in miniature. Again, I wanted the recurring theme of the protocol droid, and I wanted to make sure people realized it wasn't 3PO, but that we always have protocol droids in the movies to remind you of 3PO's true role in all this. Introducing Darth Sidious as a hologram was the way he was introduced actually in Empire Strikes Back, which is the first time we actually saw him in the first 3 films. So I thought it appropriate to keep that thematic device going, is only know him as a hologram and not to actually deal with him, except in one small scene as a real person, because I did want to make sure that you knew that he wasn't just a hologram, and make him sort of flesh and blood. When we have the attack of the droids here, it was important to establish these droids as slightly goofy rather than ominous, and not very good shots, and they have absolutely no defense against a Jedi and a laser sword. They're just hopeless. So the idea was that as we go on, that the problem of developing better combat technology is established in this movie, and then it will be dealt with further in episode 2. The failings of a robotic army in terms of their all being controlled by one source and not being as swift as a human is a theme that we play out through all the movies. It was very important in the beginning here of the film to establish that the Jedi were invincible. I've kind of reversed the classic monster coming through the door motif, where you and make it where the aliens and the droids and all the villains are faced with these 2 sort of invincible creatures, Jedi Godzillas that nothing can stop. I kind of enjoyed the idea of making the good guys invincible and the bad guys cowering in fear. They have to obviously come up against some force that drives them off the ship, and we use the wheel droids to do that. This movie is told primarily from the Jedi's point of view, but the story that's being told is essentially the story of Queen Amidala and her plight of having her planet blockaded, as in, say, episode 4, where the story is told through the eyes of the droids, and this one is told through the eyes of the Jedi. When I decided to create the planet of Naboo, I really wanted to create a planet that was timeless, but at the same time reminiscent of classic Roman Renaissance architecture. So we shot in Italy and used a lot of Italian influences in this to create an environment that was not based on technology, but based on beauty and a whole different mindset from the more technological cultures like Curacao. One of the challenges in doing a movie like this is that you want to have simultaneity in terms of the storytelling, in terms of establishing an environment, moving the plot along, and then making each shot or scene interesting in itself. We're establishing the flora and fauna in the environment, the threat of the Trade Federation, and then what we're really doing in this scene is introducing a new character, which becomes a key character later on. The challenge always in writing scenes like this is you got to try to get all these things to happen at once in the same scene. You can't just have a scene that does one thing, like, say, establish a character. You also have to keep the plot moving, and the fact that this attack is going on, and you also have to begin to introduce people into this environment, into this planet. This is actually one of my favorite scenes, especially in terms of Jar Jar. I mean, this is the scene where we really were able to take a digital character and make him photorealistic and have him interact with the live actors in a way that seemed believable. It's one of the first scenes we actually did, and I still think it's one of the best. One of the trickiest things in the Star Wars saga is to come up with new environments. Each film has 3 or 4 new environments, and it's a struggle in each film to sort of come up with something that you can use to tell the story with and isn't so bizarre or out there that you can't, it doesn't fit into the context of the universe I've created, but at the same time gives you a different visual experience in each movie. One of the thematic devices here is that these two cultures come together and join forces and become friends and are treated as equals. Where in the beginning of the film, they basically don't want to talk to each other. They don't want to have anything to do with each other. Each one is a sort of insular society. This is one of my favorite scenes because it's all digital characters except for the 2 humans. I think it came off very well in terms of the characters and the humor, and you just don't get this strong sense that you're in an animated film. You feel you're in a real place. In essence, you're watching, Roger Rabbit in Toonville. It just doesn't look like it. Part of the issue of cutting back to the Trade Federation is to keep the plot moving, but also to get this strand of the movie constantly being reminded that there are the bad guys out there, that the Trade Federation is trying to track them down, and keep the threat alive so you don't forget what the issues are, because our heroes are go for long periods of time without coming in contact with the bad guys. This underwater sequence is full of spooks coming out of the closet and other cheap tricks, which are always fun to do in a movie. Every time they turn around, they come into a kind of a more difficult situation with adversaries, and so it kind of compounds itself. This shot was a challenge when we designed it, because it's the first time we actually see the entire army, and it's followed by this sequence where we see the entire town. These are completely digital shots. There's no reality to it at all. And trying to make those look real so that, it looks like it fits into a live-action movie was a real challenge. And now we've got this, I think we accomplished that in terms of making making all these completely synthetic shots, like this one where the sub comes out of the water, look realistic enough to believe that these people are actually in this place. It was a real challenge in the beginning to think that we were going to be doing movies where, at least half of the environments were created digitally in a computer, and there just wasn't going to be anything real there at all. And a lot of these sequences are like that. And then they have to be holed up, so you can intercut them with sequences like this coming down the stairs, which is shot in an Italian palace, and then be able to cut to a totally digital environment as they come down the stairs outside the palace. The only thing we had in this shot here coming out of the palace was really them walking down a set of stairs, and everything else is fake. I mean, fake in terms of the fact that it's digital. I tend to use, in some cases, a rather abstract way of telling a story, and then I use montage editing throughout the scenes. We'll get into a dialogue scene, but when you get into an action scene, I will separate things off and not show the beginnings and ends of things, but sometimes just the middles, which gives you the sense of what's going on without the continuity of how it's actually happening. And you'll see that in a lot of these action set pieces. And then overall, on the grander scale, I do it in terms of intercutting different ideas, in terms of like the Nemoidians. We jump quite a bit. And I take some real risks in moving the story along faster than what most people are used to in a movie. But it's a style that I established in the very first film, and I've continued to use it in all of the films so that they all are consistent in terms of the style and the way they're put together and the way the story is told. And that isn't just an editorial style. It's, the acting style is done that way, the visual style. And I say the general idea of having the story be told through visuals rather than through dialogue. Visuals are music, basically. There's music through the entire movie. And even when there's no music, it's a musical decision not to have the music. It's a counterpoint kind of thing. This is a scene where we introduce R2, which was a fun moment for me, since R2 becomes a central character throughout the movie. One of the things we're doing in this movie is to introduce characters and see where they came from. The main job of the first episode really is to introduce characters. It's what the first act of a play is all about. Set up the plot and introduce the characters. And so in the whole Star Wars saga, this will be the first time that R2 is introduced. So I wanted to give him a little bit of a dramatic opening, chance to do something, be a little hero. He is a hero throughout the series. He's always the one that sort of comes through in the end and saves the day. So I thought it was appropriate at this point, when we do introduce him, that we introduce him in a bit of an action sequence where he can again establish his character as a hero, because that continues through the whole series. And I chose R2 to be the one that was introduced first. I guess I gave him the priority because, I don't know, I guess I'm partial to him. Don't tell 3PO that. He'll get upset. So not only are we able to introduce R2 in this particular moment with that action set piece, but at the same time I'm able to twist the story in a way that's necessary, because obviously I have to get them to Tatooine in order to meet Anakin, which is again part of the story. And I used that device of introducing R2 and at the same time damaging the ship so we could get to where we needed to go.
My lord.
As we come back to the Trade Federation, every time I try to introduce a new element of danger, a new threat. And in this one I introduced Darth Maul, and at the same time move the plot along on the fact that he wants to have her sign a treaty, which is the basis of the whole plot of the movie, which is they're trying to get her to turn over her planet to the Trade Federation. The Trade Federation is working on one level of greed, wanting to take over this planet, which Darth Sidious is manipulating, because in the end his agenda is completely different. He's just simply using the Trade Federation, using the Jedi, using the Queen for his own purpose. He's the puppet master in all these movies. His goal in this one, the whole plot of the movie really, is for Palpatine to become Chancellor. And this whole thing is a large bunch of machinations to allow Palpatine to ascend to the highest office in the galaxy. When we came to Tatooine, I wanted to come to Tatooine, but not come to Mos Eisley, which is where the fourth film took place. I wanted to land on a different city so that we got a different sense of what Tatooine was like, and that there were lots of different cities, and that not have the whole story take place in exactly one spot. We can get onto the same planet, but not have it be in the same city. This is quite a large city as opposed to Mos Eisley, which is a very small city. It was a lot of fun in this one to be able to have a lot of background characters that we weren't able to do before. Little funny creatures and things that I wasn't able to really have in Episode 4. Really shows how far the technology has come in terms of allowing me to make Mos Espa look the way I had wanted Mos Eisley to look in the Episode 4. To have these kinds of strange alien creatures, of which Watto is one of my favorite. One of the key elements of this and the introduction of Anakin and the development of Anakin in this film is that I wanted him to be a very earnest, very honest, very good-natured person. Just the opposite of the way you think of Darth Vader. Because the larger story is really, how does such a sweet kid like this turn into something as evil as Darth Vader? And I didn't want it to have the obvious, well, he grew up, he was a bad kid to begin with, and he just, part of the story is, how does he become bad? What choices does he make to become bad? Not, well, he was bad to begin with, so it's obvious that that's where he was going to go. So the whole character slant on this film with Anakin was to set him up and develop him and have it be a really positive character, so that in the later movies I can have something to do with him. The sequence where Jar Jar chases the little droid around, the reactions of the droid, the animators just brought a whole different level to that relationship than what I'd written and what we directed on the set. There's a backstory here that we're never going to know about between Sebulba and Anakin. The drift of it is that they're sort of rivals and not the best of friends, but you never find out exactly what happened or what was going on. You just get a flavor of what it is, but it really is designed to set up this rivalry that's going to pay off later in the pod race. This scene is designed to let Anakin see Qui-Gon's lightsaber, which again is a plot point. At the same time, trying to make Anakin kind and friendly to all the locals, and then ultimately set up the major plot progression is that they're going to stay with him for a while. Their lives are going to become intermeshed. I saw these little troglodyte storage bins for grain the first time I scouted locations for Episode 4, and I always wanted to use them in the movie. I wanted to use them in Episode 4, but there's just no room for them. So when this movie came along, I told Gavin, I said, when you go to Tunisia, go look up these grain storage bins because they're really great, and maybe we can use them for, the slave quarters or something like that. And so I managed to get them back in and, design a whole different kind of living quarter from what I'd had in the first film. And here, coming up with the idea that not only is Darth Vader Luke and Leia's father, but he's also 3PO's father. And I thought that was kind of an amusing irony in all of this, and I couldn't resist it. It gives us the opportunity for 3PO to meet R2 for the first time and start what will ultimately become a very long and arduous friendship of sorts. This is a fun scene. It was very difficult to shoot because it's a very long scene, a lot of dialogue, and each take that we did was about 10 minutes long. The scene ultimately cut itself down to about, 6 or 8 minutes, I think this is. But it's a very complicated scene, and I tried to play it in its entirety. I didn't break it up into pieces. I actually played it all the way through, which was kind of tough on Jake, because he's only 9, 10 years old, and to remember all that dialogue at a 10-minute scene and be able to go all the way through it without stopping is a challenge for anybody. But he did really well.
Very dangerous.
Dining room scenes, eating scenes are always a little tricky to shoot because of the screen direction, and the fact that I've got them basically sitting around a table talking for 10 minutes. You're sort of worried that it's not going to play, especially in something that is, in essence, an action picture. This is nothing but a very long exposition scene. You come up with things like the jokes with Jar Jar and developing his earnest character, which allow you to play the scene out as long as it plays out in order to get all the exposition out that has to be told. Almost every other word out of someone's mouth in this scene is a key expository story that needs to be told in order to understand what's going to happen next. There's a lot of mechanical things going on here. How do they get the pods? How do they get in the race? How are they going to get their engine parts? There's all that stuff comes together and is told in this one scene. You always have a scene like this in a movie. We call it the pointer scene. The classic one is in Indiana Jones when the government agents come and he explains what the Ark of the Covenant is. And he stands there with a pointer and he points at there and this is how this happens. And they open the book and they look in the book. Well, unfortunately, it's a scene you always have to have in a movie. You have to stick it somewhere. Nobody wants to do it. It's hard to get through because you're afraid it's going to be boring. But it's absolutely essential in terms of telling the story. Magically enough, it's a scene that usually ends up being about a third of the way through the movie. About 30 to 40 minutes into it. Wada was definitely one of my favorite characters in terms of CG characters that were developed for the film. This scene actually was one of the first scenes we animated. It was really exciting to watch this come together because it's the first time, again, we'd ever really had a fully animated character that we'd had to work with in terms of doing a performance. We'd have dinosaurs in Jurassic Park and that sort of thing, but never a photorealistic actual character, an alien that carried on a 5-minute dialogue scene. It turned out much better than we expected. I've also developed a style of ending up with different people in different places. Something like an American Graffiti where we cut 4 completely different stories, intercut them. I like and tend toward having a lot of characters and then intercutting all the characters and their stories going on simultaneously, especially when we get down toward the end of the movie. The last reel is always a lot of different people in different places interacting, which gives you a lot of editorial dynamics and challenges in terms of being able to keep track of everything and everybody. This is a hotel just like the grain cellars. This grain cellars that were turned into a hotel that I visited the first time I ever went to Tunisia, and said to myself, someday I'm going to put this in a movie and try to get it into Episode 4, A New Hope, but was never able to do it, so we trekked out in the middle of nowhere to shoot this scene. I wanted to get that sense in the movie that a certain environment that I grew up, which is, the old battered car sitting in the backyard that you work on, or somebody's working on, year after year after year, and it never really goes anywhere. But a friend of mine's father had a car like this. It was sitting in his garage, and every weekend he'd work on that car. And he did it, for as long as I was living in Modesto. It was like 20 years. And I don't think he ever finished it. But I think it's something I feel very nostalgic about. It's funny, this simple little scene. For a lot of younger kids, they find it almost intolerable to watch. Having his hand sitting in the fan of the car and the kid about to start the car up. It's amazing how different age groups find different levels of tension or enjoyment. In the original script, didn't have this scene, but I really wanted to get a sense of Anakin's future and Anakin's dreams and where he expected to go. And I thought I needed this little introspective moment. The plot device in this is that he has to get the blood sample in order to figure out the midichlorian count. But before, we did it in a garage. But I took it out of the garage, rewrote it, and put it on the balcony at night so we could talk about the stars and going to the stars and that sort of thing. Bringing midichlorians into it as a device is something that existed from the beginning, but I never really had the time to go into any explanation, because every time these rather larger concepts come into play, how does the galaxy work, what is the Force, all this kind of stuff, you have to be very sort of cryptic and deal in almost fortune cookie descriptions of things, and so it's very difficult to get a concept across. But I figured in this whole movie I could begin to bring out the idea of midichlorians and their job in being sensitive to the Force, and why some people are more susceptible to the Force than others, which is an issue that's in the first film, but you never know why some people have the Force is stronger with some people and not strong with other people. What is the device that causes that to happen? And I also like the idea of this symbiotic relationships, which is, and again, an ongoing theme in the whole movie of people helping people, that there may be a completely different race of life form that lives inside your body, completely independent of you, but has some influence over you. This was a fun shot because we made it up. It had no pan in the original shot. You didn't pan over to R2 and 3PO, but we were able to create that digitally, take a regular shot and just move it and turn it into a pan, and then add the part with 3PO and R2. Just the beginnings of learning how to create really 3D worlds using 2D images, where you shot something but you want to continue it, but you didn't do it because it wasn't there. The original cut of this grid sequence was quite long. We just kept cutting it down and down because it sort of got out of proportion with the rest of the movie and the rest of the pod race. I mean, it was cute and we loved it, but we were afraid that an audience would get bored with it. When I saw it we went through the outtakes for the DVD, decided to put it back in the movie, or at least parts of it. You'll notice that on the outtakes on the DVD, it's actually longer than it is here, even though we added a few sequences back in. It's the great thing about a DVD is you can actually focus more on the movie than you focus on the first few weeks of the film being released, because you're always concerned that when the movie goes out there, people are going to be bored, they're not going to like it, and as a result, it doesn't work, and you lose everything. And that clouds your mind to keeping in a lot of little fun things that you like yourself, but you don't know whether they're, worth the extra length in the film, which risks the the quality of the whole movie, or at least the success of the whole movie. I like this scene because with Jabba, because it was all constructed out of bits and pieces. The Darling women were shot at one point. Bib Fortuna was shot at another point. The set was a miniature. The guards were shot at a different point. One of the more fun things about this pod race is that nothing's real. I mean, this is literally our little cast of characters on in the little pod here, but the rest is just empty desert. And we did just shoot this outside so that we would get a realistic effect. It had the wind and the weather and the quality that the rest of it had, but there's so little of this that's real. We had some pods out there on the set, but we didn't use them too much except for the pre-pod race. Once we got into the actual race part, everything's digital. In the original Star Wars, a scene like this would have been completely impossible, with this many extras and the vastness of this set. The complications of doing this kind of a race in a real environment, not in space. But to be able to create the environment, because you really have to have a very, very large set, or a miniature set, or in this case, we were able to create it in a computer, which allows you to make it endless. In the old way of making movies, you just couldn't even think about doing something like this. You'd build a miniature set that would go on for a quarter of a mile in order to get these shots, and obviously that you just couldn't do something like that. Once I realized I had this digital power at my disposal, my first instinct how to use it was to do a race over an environment. I mean, I love speed and I love racing cars, and this is like the ultimate kid version of racing cars. This was an exercise in being able to do a lot of things that were just completely impossible to tell this movie. It also, besides being a fun action sequence, the point to this whole exercise was this is how Qui-Gon realizes that Anakin is special. Besides the fact that he has a high midichlorian count, it shows that he has a lot of agility and a lot of skills and an ability to see things before they happen and that sort of thing. There are a lot of issues in here. Again, like the couplers coming apart and Ben Quadinaris' car coming apart, which are, make a lot of sense if you're from Tatooine and know how all this works, but I think for some of the audience it goes right past without them being able to follow it. But like all the Star Wars films, the more you sort of see it over and over again and the more you understand what's going on, after a while it'll make perfect sense because there is a logic to it all. It's been put in there. If you know what power couplers are and how they work and what the dynamics of these racers are and all that sort of thing. Ben and I worked on the sound a lot to come up with sounds that were like real race cars, shifting gears and different sounds for different engines. Each engine has its own personality, very much like a regular Formula One or a sports car race where there's a lot of different personality in the cars just through the sounds. And it was a real trick that I struggled with to say, how can an 8-year-old boy appear to be competent racing something like this? And so worked very hard to make it believable that Anakin really did have the ability, even though he was special, but that it was a believable idea that a kid this age could actually control a racing vehicle this intense. I mean, it's completely possible. I mean, there's lots of kids that are 8 and 9 years old that are dirt bike racing and go-kart racing and doing all kinds of things that are as intense as this. But you got to make the general audience believe that that's possible. Digital filmmaking definitely frees up your imagination, because I wouldn't even allow myself to think of a scene like this before, because it would just be, impossible to do. It was on all levels, financial and technical, you just couldn't accomplish this. And so it's fun to be able to do something that you kind of had dreamed about over the years. But even, only in fantasy, as you're sitting writing a script, say, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could do this? Wouldn't it be great if I could do that? But to finally be able to say, okay, I'm going to do it. And then see it come off as well as ILM was able to pull it off. Because, to me it looks sufficiently realistic that I believe I'm actually there. The guys at ILM did a great job of creating an environment for these things to pass through. I mean, it's a completely digital environment. But again, it looks as photorealistic as anything I could have ever shot if I'd have gone into some canyon somewhere. It's a little tricky telling the story of how these two pods get hooked together and then break apart, and what Anakin does in terms of accelerating to cut them loose, and then at the same time it sets Sebulba off balance so that he loses control of his vehicle. It's again told visually rather than logically, so you get the sense of what's going on without actually knowing how it happened. This scene where his mother congratulates and kisses him was in and out of the movie several times. I think it's ultimately a very important scene. Without it, it just didn't play very well. We needed to have closure on the event of the race, because the race was so dramatic that you sort of need to have not just him being held up on the shoulders, but you needed actually more closure on that race than what we were able to give it with that one shot. The scene in the box after the race with Wada was one of my favorite scenes. I just love the views and the angles and everything. Again, you gotta remember the only person in this whole scene really is Qui-Gon, and everything else is basically manufactured. So it's basically just Liam walking around on a blue screen. This is a scene that we shot. We thought we'd outsmart ourselves, so we had him put his little braid on the wrong side because I was going to flop the whole thing, and then it turned out I didn't do it, so I kind of outsmarted myself. I've got 3 scenes here kind of back to back with Annie and his mother. Well, he has to say, besides saying goodbye to 3PO, but they're really primarily about Annie and his mother, which is quite a bit of time overall for a movie like this, but the relationship between Anakin and his mother is sort of crucial to what happens later on. And I wanted to give this moment of their parting sufficient emphasis, and to understand that it was Annie's choice really to go along and become a Jedi. In the beginning here, thinking that his mother was going to come along with him, and then later realizing that she wasn't, and realizing he was going to go off on his own, and making that as difficult as possible without going overboard. I've actually, when I shot this scene, there was quite a bit more crying and carrying on, and it sort of went emotionally, I think, over the top, melodramatically from what the rest of the movies are and what the style I'd created for myself. So I toned it down a bit, kept it, the idea going there, but didn't really go for what one would say the gold of hysteria, an emotional, breakdown. It just seemed like too much when we began to watch it. It seemed out of place with the rest of the movie. Part of the challenge was to make the mother loving and kind and not reject him, support him in his need to go, but understanding that his only hope for any kind of future was to go off and become a Jedi, and that he had no real chance at life living on Tatooine, and make it painful for her to see him go, but at the same time make her strong enough to support him in his decision, without her falling apart. And I actually have it both ways. I have some takes that are a little less emotional in this, and I have some that are way more emotional. But you get yourself into a place in a movie where if you go too emotionally, and it makes everything too important, and puts you emotionally in a place where you can't get out of in terms of the rest of the story and the believability of the rest of the story. So the challenge always in these kind of films is to keep it kind of light and not too realistic, but still have it be believable. It's kind of a theme that reoccurs in episode 4, as I purposely develop themes and ideas and repeat them. It's very, very clear in the 2 trilogies that I'm putting the characters in pretty much the same situations, sometimes even using the same dialogue, so that the father and the son go through pretty much the same experience. Obviously, Anakin takes a different road than his son takes, so that at some of these turning points they go the other way, but it's been set up for you to almost expect that they will go, that Luke will follow in his father's footsteps, because in a lot of these episodes they do follow each other, which leads to a subtle influence which gives the audience a little expectation. And say it's a musical idea. You have a lyrical refrain and you keep playing it over and over again in different using different instrumentation, different octaves. It changes every time you rehear it. It's the same note played differently. I've tried to use that right from the very beginning. When I did Star Wars, I was doing that. It really came out from something I was trying to do in THX, my first film I ever did, which was, instead of 3 acts, there's almost like 3 different movies, but each movie is telling the same story in a different way. I became fascinated with that idea of, it's kind of visual jazz. It's like you go off on a riff on the same idea, and you just take the concept and you just interpret it differently visually. And there's a lot of that going on in these movies. I like the idea of cyclical motifs that keep recurring over and over and over again. Anakin's position here when he leaves his mother is not that much different from when Obi-Wan asked him to come along with him on his adventure. And he decides he can't do it because he has all these obligations and he doesn't want to leave his home. And even though he's very anxious to leave, from the first part of the movie, it's the same kind of conflict. In this one, he takes the road. In the one with Luke, he decides not to take the road, but the inevitability of events force him to take the road. It's sort of like fate. And it would be the same thing here. But in this case, he didn't wait for fate to push him into this. He took the road. The scene where we first get a confrontation between a Jedi and a Sith, I wanted to be very abstract, not deal with it, because we have to, the end of the movie, the climax of the movie is the confrontation of these 2 characters. So I didn't want to give it away at this point. So I did it with a lot of swirling robes and flashing swords and kicking up a lot of dust, but not actually seeing the fight. This is really a little teaser of what we obviously are going to have at the end of the movie. This is a little scene I toyed with over and over again, which is the introduction of Anakin to Obi-Wan. Obviously a very important moment, but I didn't want to overplay it And I had this initial skepticism on Obi-Wan's part. Obi-Wan is not a big fan of Anakin's in this movie. That doesn't happen until later on. What you really got here are two characters who are both off on a very difficult journey, both feeling very alone and comforting each other. Padme gets comfort from comforting Anakin, but it also gives her a chance to reflect a little bit on the problems she's having in terms of making decisions about what she's going to do about this situation of her people suffering. Her only hope at this point in the movie is to go to Coruscant, go to the Senate, and hope that justice will be done and her people will be freed. But I think underneath that, I've been trying to set up the fact that she's skeptical about whether this is all going to really work. I mean, she has to believe it because it's the only choice she has. This is the first time we come to Coruscant. I was never able to do it before. I did it sort of in little bits and pieces, but I was never able to actually show the real city because it would have been too costly and too difficult. You know, when you're making a movie where the central action is happening on some capital planet, but you never get to go there, you only hear about it, is not a fun way to tell a story. But this way I could go right into the middle of it and see this whole aspect of the Republic, which is very crucial to the whole story because that's what it's about, is the Emperor coming to take over, and how did a democracy turn into a dictatorship. One of our main characters, Anakin, is a little boy from Tatooine who has never been off-world, so to speak. And so I really wanted to tell this particular scene from the point of view of Anakin about the wonder of being in this amazing environment with all these very important people that he doesn't really understand what they're talking about or what's going on. And his only friend really is Padme. So he's using her as his anchor. There's conversations going on that are sort of above his head that we don't really know what they're talking about. A very elaborate environment, very different from Tatooine. And I wanted to really get the wonder of the Republic and the government and the giant city from Anakin's point of view, because I thought that would be the most interesting way to reveal this particular environment, which is, I guess in the end, probably one of the more glorious and impossible to do if you don't have digital technology. We also decided to add on, before we had this scene where we got to see a little bit of the planet in the taxi, and in an effort to shorten the movie, we pulled it out and I put it back in again, because it does give a chance to see a little bit of the environment, a little bit of the city that, a planet that is a complete city, and show it off a little bit, the wonder of it all. From then on, I very purposely kept Anakin sort of on the sidelines. The Gungan and the boy are always kind of, outside in the hallway somewhere. But that is the way it would be. They wouldn't be included in these kinds of meetings. They're kind of puzzled by what's going on. They're standing on the sidelines. It's a little bit a riff on the very first film, where the story is told through the point of view of the droids, who were sort of the lowliest characters. In this one, I'm doing it through primarily the two Jedi, but then the secondary characters are also carrying a lot of the weight when the Jedi aren't around, which is basically Jar Jar and Anakin. Because the central story is ultimately the Queen's dilemma and the Queen's problem of the threat to her planet and her people, and how is she going to save them. Plot-wise, we're dealing with the insistence of Obi-Wan in taking on this young kid and training him, even though it's, in theory, the child should have been trained by Yoda until he was about 7 or 8 years old. And then when he was 7 or 8, he'd be given a Jedi. He'd become the Padawan learner to a Jedi. So here we're having Qui-Gon wanting to skip the early training and jump right to taking him on as his Padawan learner, which is controversial and ultimately the source of much of the problems that develop later on. This is actually a scene that we added later. When I cut the film together and looked at it, I needed to set up something that explained where Padme was going to be during these next few scenes, because Padme disappears, because obviously Padme is the queen. So I needed to come up with some reason why we don't see Padme in this next series of scenes until we get back on the plane. One of the thematic issues here is how Palpatine becomes Chancellor, telling how he moved to the next level. And then when you see all of the films together, it'll all make a lot more sense. But this is kind of a very small thematic issue that transcends all 6 movies, as opposed to something that's actually neatly tied up in this particular movie. Although step 1 is that Palpatine becomes Chancellor, and you'll see in episode 2 that he then makes another step, and in episode 3 he makes another step. In the design of this scene, we really wanted to work on something that would show you that there are thousands and thousands of delegates into this government body and that there would be some kind of unique way in which they were able to express themselves and carry on the government, but do it on a very grand scale, and came up with this sort of large stadium design with these little pods that move around inside it, which gives it a different look, but at the same time it seems very functional and realistic, even though it's completely not realistic.
By the droid armies of the...
One of the primary issues between this relationship between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon is that this is establishing Obi-Wan as the kind of straight arrow, the center of the movie, and Qui-Gon as the rebel, as the one who's constantly sort of pushing the envelope, which will switch itself in the next movie when, rather than having his master be the rebel, he has his Padawan learner become the rebel. I'm using Obi-Wan as sort of this centering device through all these movies, even as we get in with Luke and everybody else later on. Doing this next trilogy and starting off with Phantom Menace gave me a chance to introduce things that are only hinted at in the later movies, 4, 5, and 6, which is the Jedi Council. How does it operate? You get to see, rather than just one or two fallen Jedi or half-trained Jedi or exiled Jedi, you actually get to see the Jedi in full operation, their temple that they operate out of. This was a challenge to make this all concrete and real. This scene begins to set up the relationship between the Gungans and the Queen. It's a setup for later on when she asks the Gungans for help. It's also moving along the plot of Palpatine becoming the Chancellor. And more importantly, it's the key scene where the Queen, rather than sitting passively by and watching all this stuff transpire, takes affirmative action and decides to go back to her planet and go back to her people. I've had this written several different ways, and at the same time I have several scenes that carry this idea further in terms of her, the conflict she's having between being passive and aggressive, and in terms of fighting and being peaceful. Because for her, it's a break of all of her principles to go back and fight. In this scene, she doesn't really intend to go back and fight, but she does intend to go back, which will lead to a fight, and she knows that. But she's still hoping that she can resolve it in some way that doesn't involve a war. This was a little tricky in writing the script, in that I didn't want Anakin to become a Jedi yet, because I'm saving that for the end of the movie. But at the same time, I still had to have him tag along. And I was able to use really the device of the fact that Anakin had been put in Qui-Gon's care, and that he had promised his mother that he would take care of him, as a way of allowing them to take the boy along with him on this trek to the next third of the movie. But one of the difficulties of writing a script with lots and lots of characters is you have to be able to rationalize why everybody is along. If you have a film like Dirty Dozen, where you sort of establish they're all going out on a mission together and you gather them all up and they go, it's pretty easy. But when you got a situation like this where there isn't any mandate that they stay together, that they're there for transitory reasons that are constantly having to be renewed as the plot progresses, it becomes much more difficult to be able to get all the characters in on the act and take them along on whatever journey you're going on. We also get into this thing of what are midichlorians, how do they work, which advances a little bit of the story of the Force and how does the Force work and how do we come to know the Force, which is part of Anakin's training and learning to become a Jedi. We had to take the idea of the Force one step further. The midichlorians are kind of a side issue, not the sort of spiritual, metaphysical part of the Force, but the more practical, biological, physical part of the Force, or how we come to know the Force, which has to do really with the genetics of why some people are more tuned to the Force than others. One of the things that I'm doing in these films is to give it a little bit of realities, to give the shots a kind of documentary feel where things float off the shot. I don't really put people in the center, and I let them sort of drift around in the frame a little bit more than you normally do in a movie. This is especially true in this scene here, as she goes up the ramp, where Jar Jar goes almost completely off the camera, and then as Anakin and R2 approach, well, Jar Jar's an animated character. I can put him wherever I want. But I purposely put him way off the side of the screen there. It just gives you the sense that it wasn't just staged perfectly for the camera, that things are kind of caught. They aren't perfect. It actually happened, that Jar Jar was actually there. And I actually had to frame him, but I didn't, because he wasn't there. Throughout the film, I have been playing with the fact earlier on that Qui-Gon knows that Padme is the queen. And he uses that, especially when they go on Tatooine. He taunts her a couple times. And in the pod race, he taunts her a couple times. Because he's just having fun with her, because he knows she's the queen. But the others around him don't. So he's been waiting for her to step forward and reveal herself. Anakin is completely surprised, but Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon aren't. This is a bit of a reveal to have the hologram walking along with them, and then you don't know how they're doing it. And you reveal that little walking machine that the hologram is standing on. And at the same time, you get to say, kill all of them. This sequence has a little bit of a Japanese influence with the Gungans and their feathers on the back of their cadoos. But I wanted to give you the sense that they were leaving the safety of their fog-shrouded jungle and going into the plains where they're out in the open and vulnerable to attack. The linchpin of this plot device of the droids being controlled by one source is based on the inability of the Neimoidians to give up control to the droids. Because if they could think for themselves and do things on their own, they would worry about having this giant army that might take them over. Because they would assume that their way of thinking, which is greedy and power-driven to consume and ravage, would be eventually the droids would do the same thing and take over them. Having grown up in the shadow of the Vietnam War, the issue of a primitive society confronting a technologically advanced society has fascinated me, because that was the main event that was going on really during my college years. And the fact that human determination and human spirit could overcome these vastly superior armies, actually I found to be rather inspiring as a human being. I think that is a theme, one of the main themes that's gone through all the Star Wars films. I like technology, I use technology, but at the same time, I understand the failings of technology, and you can't rely on technology for everything. So I have this dual nature in the movies of the friendly human good technology of R2 and 3PO and the evil technology of the battle droids and that sort of thing. I'm constantly playing with those two ends of the dilemma, but never really saying that one is better than the other. I'm just simply trying to promote the human spirit, even if it exists in a droid. So I've got three main pieces of action going on here, which is the sword fight, the Queen trying to get to her objective, which is the Viceroy of the Trade Federation, and the starship battle, of which Anakin plays a pivotal role. One of the trickier issues here was how to get Anakin up into the air in a kind of accidental, vaguely believable sort of way, which is one of the reasons why we had the pod race and everything, was to establish that he actually was pretty good at controlling mechanical devices and knowing how they work. We had this ending cut lots of different ways. In a lot of my movies, I end them with the intercutting of 3 or 4 different events at the same time. So it came out of American Graffiti, where I was telling 4 stories and intercutting them, and now I've developed this idea of challenging myself to see how many stories I can tell simultaneously at the end of the movie. I think I've slowed down on it a little bit, but this was very challenging in that there were, trying to get the balance right between the stories, and then coming up with little humorous pieces for Jar Jar to exploit the fact that he's a bumbler, but at the same time make his bumbling be the thing that helps turn the tide of the battle for the Gungans, even though they don't win the battle. Anakin and Jar Jar are both playing the same note in this, which is they're kind of bumbling their way through and coming out heroes. The actual take of those guys going up the side of the building, we did do several takes. We never did get it right, actually, because one of the guys wasn't pulled up fast enough, you can see there. So we had to sort of optically make him go faster in the next shot to catch up with the other ones. But that was as close as we came to actually making it work. But there was always somebody who didn't get pulled up. In the sequence with Jar Jar, I wanted to have this comedy element going in the middle of the battle. The comedy of Buster Keaton was an inspiration for some of this, especially the sequence here where he hides under the trailer full of energy balls and then pulls them down and they chase him down the hillside. There was a sequence with this in a Buster Keaton movie with barrels, where he was chased down a hill with barrels. And then we added the idea that they would, when they hit the tanks, they would blow up the tanks, and then it would sort of turn the tide of the battle. You get to a point in the film, always in a film, where everything gets very, very dark, where it looks like the bad guys are going to win. And when you got all these stories going on, I have to have it look like Anakin's going to be destroyed, the Jedi are going to be destroyed, the Queen has been captured, and the Gungans have been captured. So there's a point here where all the stories come together at their blackest moment, where everybody's captured, everybody's getting killed, everything's very dark, and it doesn't look like they're going to get out of it. That's a tradition of serials, all kinds of Saturday matinee adventures. Down toward the end here, where everything is very bleak, and everybody's at their lowest moment, I purposely started to intermesh the images in a way that would create greater tension, like in this sequence here where the droids are coming after Anakin. Anakin's trapped, he's about to be killed. Immediately cut to a giant close-up of Darth Maul. He's almost looking at Anakin, and then you realize you're in the next scene, and it's these things. But it's trying to almost confuse and meld together the various sequences that are in various different places, so that you get a sense that they're all in trouble and they're all very connected. One of the most difficult parts of this end was to contrive a situation where I could separate Obi-Wan from Qui-Gon, because I had to have a situation where Qui-Gon could get trapped behind the gates later on, and Obi-Wan could watch while he was killed, but that there wasn't anything he could do about it. There's a tricky thing going on here too, which is that I have to build the sword fight to the end with Obi-Wan, but I still wanted to get a really good fight with Liam. But you'll see a lot of these sequences here end with a close-up of a person looking, so they're almost looking into the next sequence, so that it blends those sequences together. It's very, very soft transitions. This was a fun sword fight with Ewan and Rey, because they were really into it, and they were very much out to prove who was the better swordsman, and they were very much challenging each other, which made for very exhausting shooting, but very exciting. They would finish this, and their swords would almost be bent in half. They were hitting each other so hard. Again, a kind of recurring theme of Obi-Wan. He falls over the ridge earlier, falls over the ridge here, copying kind of what happens in Empire Strikes Back with Luke in the same kind of sword fight with the Sith, falling, going over the edge before he gets his hand cut off. In this case, we twist it at the end. Instead of the Sith cutting off the hand of the Jedi cuts the Sith in half. And again, intercutting these whole sequences and who succeeded and in what order. This has all been changed around several different times. It seems very obvious now, but when you have 4 endings, basically, you have to figure out which ending is the most important ending and save that one for last, which is this one, and the most shocking, really, which is Darth Maul getting cut in half. And you make that the last ending. Plot-wise, the whole issue here is that Obi-Wan has to take over the training of the kid, because that's the theme that goes through all the rest of the movies. I mean, that haunts him for the next 6 movies. This scene here is the one that did take place in the Queen's Chamber, but I decided to take it out of there and then move it down later here, because as it turned out, we needed a little bit more time after the movie to settle down, and we needed a little bit more finality to the Neimoidians being sent off to prison or wherever they're going. And I also wanted to bring Palpatine back, but I really wanted to finish that story, and I wanted to have this little moment where he tells Anakin that he's going to be paying more attention to him in the future. The scene with Yoda was another scene that got added. When we saw it all put together, we really needed to spell out that Obi-Wan was going to take over the training. Before, it was in the scene, in Qui-Gon's death scene, and it just seemed out of place in that context of the funeral and all those kinds of things. We had the piece where Obi-Wan tells Anakin that he's going to take over his training, but we never saw this scene where he was given the assignment, and ultimately it really needed this. The end of the last film is Anakin at a funeral pyre, just like Qui-Gon is here. So I wanted to keep those motifs, again, things to harken back to other things that have been going on in the movie. We then have this moment, which is very important, where Obi-Wan commits and tells Anakin that he's going to train him, because that's where the rest of the movies go. There's a very subtle thing going on here through the next 2 movies of Palpatine's involvement with Anakin, which isn't on screen. It's all sort of hinted at. Traditionally in Star Wars, just with the title sequence in the beginning and the way that is so structured, I always have a musical sequence at the end. It ends in some kind of a celebration or some kind of an emotional event that is purely musical in nature, has no dialogue. So usually the last 2 minutes of the film are musical, and they then iris into the end titles. Very structured, trying to keep a certain structure and a certain motif going through all the movies. So they all start the same way, they all end the same way, and they have these recurring themes and these cycles of events and incidents that sort of reverberate through all the movies in different ways.